African Society, Anglo-Ethiopian Society, and the Global Heritage Fund UK. My name is Shushan. I'm Programme Officer for the RAS. Before I hand over to Barbara Schwepke, I'd like to make a few housekeeping announcements. Could I please ask you all to switch your phones to silent to avoid interruptions? For those of you who have smartphones and are on Twitter, please find us on @RoyAfriSoc and tweet about anything that might inspire you this evening using #RiseEvents. As some of you may know, the Royal African Society is a membership organisation, so please join us, and you can look online on our website to find out more information. Also, I have really great news. Film Africa is currently taking place. It's our annual film festival, and we've got a special strand on Ethiopia. So you've got two films that you could see. One's called Lamb by Iridescent, and Price of Love as well by Herman Haile. And there's brochures outside, so please join us for some screenings. Thank you.
My name is Barbara Schwepke. I would like to also start with thanking the sponsors or the partners in this venture, the Royal African Society, the Anglo-Ethiopian Society, and the Global Heritage Fund UK. I have the great honor to introduce you to the speakers tonight, and of course, ladies first. Angela Raven Roberts has a lifelong connection and commitment to Ethiopia and the Horn of Africa. She has lived and worked through 3 regimes in Ethiopia and returns regularly on various research and work assignments. Her career spans 30 years of work with the United Nations, NGOs, and academia in the humanitarian and development sector. Educated in the United States of America and the United Kingdom, Dr. Raven Roberts holds a PhD in anthropology and development from the University of Minnesota, a master's degree in social anthropology from Oxford, and a bachelor's degree from this illustrious organization, the Haile Selassie. She is currently a research associate at the Institute of Gender Studies at Lady Margaret Hall and Department of Education in Oxford, working on capacity development, specializing on the role of national civil service, CERS plural, in disaster preparedness and reviewing current educational policies for pastoral communities in the Horn of Africa. And the Mockler's famous book, Haile Selassie's War, the Italian-Ethiopian campaign from 1935 to 1940, has been called a triumph of scholarship, conciseness, and cohesion, of order over chaos by the Times Literary Supplement, and a brilliant record of the almost forgotten Anglo-Italian struggle for Ethiopia and the Horn of Africa by the Times. But how do I introduce our main speaker tonight? It depends very much on which hat I'm wearing. As the chair of the trustees of the Ginkgo Library, a charitable project promoting dialogue between the Middle East and North Africa and the West, I can proudly introduce him as our advisor, who is uniquely qualified to guide our project in matters of interfaith dialogue, as he, as probably most of you know, as Lich Asserate is the great-grandson of Empress Menen Aswa, and therefore a descendant of the Royal House of Ethiopia and of the Holy Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon his name. The title of his autobiography, Ein Prinz aus dem Hause David und warum in Deutschland blieb, refers to his lineage, which links him to Menelik I, the legendary son of King David and the Queen of Sheba. As he combines both lineages with being a member of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, Asfa was the obvious choice as chairman of Pactum Africanum, the Alliance for the Promotion of the Abrahamic Dialogue in Africa. Now I put my other hat on. As fellow historian, I can introduce him as Dr. Prince Asfa-Wossen Asserate, and his publisher, who also happens to be a fellow German. I am even more proud to introduce him as the winner of the Adelbert von Chamisso Prize, a unique literary prize awarded to a book written in German by somebody whose native language is not German. This year, he topped this by being awarded the Jacob Grimm Prize, which is awarded for services to the German language. I'm not going to bore you with the awards sort of praise, but I just think it is quite incredible that he would be awarded both prizes. And especially as they praise his delightfully humorous prose, something that should appeal to the English language readership, and therefore we decided to translate his book into English. This is the first book of Asfa's which has been translated into English, and it is the biography of his great uncle Haile Selassie, which we are launching tonight, and it might win a similar prize for honours to the English language if such a prize existed. But somehow the English are not as surprised as we Germans if somebody speaks the language flawlessly and studies at the top university in this country. Or is that the other place? Maybe he will receive, however, a prize for Project E, which is Ethiopia, Education and English. But I'm most proud to introduce him as Rebecca's brother, who Rebecca brought to my little bookshop in 2006, and who in the years since has become my friend. So thank you, Rebecca. And over to Asfa.
Well, what can I say now? But thank you, my dear Barbara. It's great to be here. It's great to be in London, and I'm very proud to be in London, and I'm very proud as you said, becoming. This is the first and not the last. I sincerely hope this is the first and not the last book. And a good friend of mine today said perhaps Haus might even decide on publishing the Amharic edition of this book. I know you have done Arabic and Farsi translations up to now, and why not Amharic one of these days? And we will have Haus Publishing in Addis Ababa. Ladies and gentlemen, it's a great pleasure to see so many of you coming here on this foggy day. It took me 4.5 hours yesterday delay to get from Frankfurt to London. And I'm afraid there are some of us there were many friends from Norfolk and other places who wanted to come, but the fog is so thick that they were afraid they might not be able to return home. But it's a full house, and what more does an author want? I'm terribly pleased to see very old friends from Cambridge, from Ethiopia, from my childhood days. My entire family is here, my cousins, aunts, God knows, many, many friends, and many new friends, I hope. And I hope we will have a nice evening, and this will not be an evening of monologue, but of dialogue, that we will exchange ideas and see if we get any nearer to this fascinating human being called Haile Selassie I, a man who has left his mark on the 20th century.
before going on to His Majesty, before going on to His Majesty, I would just like to say a few words about Asfa-Wossen's family, which is no news, no doubt, to almost everybody here, but maybe news to a few people. That's to say, his grandfather was Ras Kassa, and Ras Kassa had 4 sons, of whom 3 were shot by the Italians after the Italian invasion in December 1936. Just much one dozen Kassa was captured by a Wallo Banda, Italian officer, near the Takazi River, and was shot. That was, I suppose, a military engagement, so not so bad. This was, of course, during the beginnings of the resistance. Then Abera and Asfa-Wossen Kassa were trapped by General Traccia in Fike, and treacherously shot in the marketplace at Fike in December 1936. And as I'm sure all of you know, those at least were shot by the Italians, by recognized enemies, whereas Ras Asserate, Asfa-Wossen's father, was shot by his own countrymen in the notorious massacre in November 1974. So much for, unfortunately for Asfa-Wossen, he'd been sent, as is mentioned in this book, by his father, despite wanting to stay behind and sort of see things through. He'd been sent back to Germany, which, as things worked out, is just as well. Now, getting on to Haile Selassie, I'd like to begin by asking Asfa-Wossen about Haile Selassie's personal life, about which we hear very little, really. There was one fascinating point I picked up in the book, which was that shortly after his coronation, and by the way, today is not only All Souls' Day, but the 85th anniversary of His Majesty's coronation, which is perhaps worth remembering and drinking a toast to later on. But there's a fascinating bit in Asfa-Wossen's book where he mentions that the emperor was possibly considering, shortly around the period of his coronation, leaving his wife, the Empress Menen, for the beautiful daughter, whom I'd never heard of the beautiful sister of Raseon, the daughter of Ras Mangasha, therefore. Asta Mangasha. And Menen said, well, if he wants to leave me, I've always had a passion for Ras Haile.
The other way round, the other way round.
Which seemed to be quite extraordinary. There's also an interesting point that I hadn't quite got till I looked at the family tree in the back of Asfa-Wossen's book, and there's really no reference to this in your book, about his first marriage and his daughter Princess Romani Work and his grandchildren Samson Bayeni married, and I know nothing about them or the background to that. So perhaps you could begin by talking about the family life of Haile Selassie, avoiding perhaps the Crown Prince, which comes in later.
Well, as far as his first marriage is concerned, it was he married at a very young age, and out of that marriage came Princess Romana Work, who had 2 sons, and they had sons, and I think one of the sons should be here today, Celeste, but I haven't seen him yet. That is the first one, but of course then Ieyasu wanted to pull him, because he had always heard that Ras Makonden's son might be the new leader of Ethiopia. And he wanted that some way or the other he should, although they were rivals, but somehow or the other, this man, this new young man, should be pulled into the family. And so he gave his niece to the emperor. She was married to Ras, and he took her from there, and this was an official political marriage, you could say, which then became a really great love affair. One has to say that. They were incredibly close. And so he married Empress Menen, out of which came 6 children. As far as this little episode is concerned with Zoroaster, Gesha, she was an incredibly beautiful woman, there's no doubt about it, and the emperor was a young man, don't forget, at that time, 1930. So no doubt there was he might have considered, but at the end, I think my grandfather also played a role in this, saying this cannot be done, she has stuck up to you all the time, and you cannot do this. And somehow they two got together, and the whole thing was worked out, and the Empress Menen joined him and was crowned with him. By the way, an incredibly new thing in the history of Ethiopia. She was the first lady to be crowned as an equal with the Ethiopian emperor. This is the very first. And of course, very little is known about her, and I have tried to put a little bit about this wonderful woman who very few people have written about, what she has done for Ethiopia, what she has done for Ethiopian women, including the establishment of the first school for women only. She was the first president of the Ethiopian Red Cross and played a vital role in helping the Ethiopian soldiers during the Second World War. So there's a lot to be, and I sincerely hope that some young scholars will take the Empress of Ethiopia as a subject, and hopefully it will be a lady scholar who will one day write a good biography of the late Emperor, Empress Menen. What about you, Angela? Wouldn't that be a good thing?
Pleasure. But I think that there's a lot of interest. I think it will come. There's a new generation out there, and I'm very interested in these topics. And in fact, there's a PhD from Michigan State University by the daughter of another quite famous Ethiopian, and her name is Heran Sirke Berhan, and she's done an excellent PhD on the whole issue that you mentioned on how marriages and the role of marriages, and therefore also the role of women. So we are getting there.
Yes, I mean, this is the most fascinating thing about Ethiopia. I think if there is one country in the whole of Africa where I don't think women need emancipation, it is Ethiopia. To be very honest with you, I would say that about most African countries, but specifically Ethiopia, I have to say, women are incredibly emancipated. Don't forget, Ethiopia, the first Ethiopian constitution dates back to 1931. And from that day on, women and men had the same rights. Do you know when equal rights were given to women in Switzerland? In 1973. So we can be proud of that.
While we're on the subject of women, can you just tell us what actually happened to the beautiful Princess Asfa?
You seem to be fascinated. I think she was married to Rasgetacho afterwards. That is what happened to her. And she lived quite a long life. But she wasn't, nobody touched her, or she wasn't put into exile. That was the end of the affair. But you know, you asked me about the emperor as a human being. Of course, as you know, I was a teenager, and when I left Ethiopia the last time in '74, I was in my 20s. I was 24 years of age when the revolution started. So whatever my relationship to the emperor, it was a familiar one. I didn't hold a governmental post. So I saw him all the time as the head of our family, as the great father of Ethiopia, father of our family. And whatever it was, there was one thing which you felt at any time when you were with him. He was the personification of the word dignity. I'll give you an example. I think there was only one time in my life when I saw the late emperor as an ordinary human being. He had come to Asmara in Eritrea when my father was Governor General. And one afternoon, he came to the private houses where my father was staying. And when he went through the drawing room, he saw a billiard table. And he wanted to play billiards. I can assure you there's not one Ethiopian human being, I don't think, who has ever seen an Ethiopian emperor holding a cue. His eyes went up. He took his jacket off, gave it to my father. Rasamuru was there, and he said to him, "Now, old man, do you remember how we used to play snooker in the house of Lijiyasu? Can you still do it?" Rasamuru said, "Well, I'll try." And he went. And then Rasamuru said, "Asrata, you too, you have to come." So the emperor's jacket wandered off to me, and I was standing there. And within minutes, you will not imagine, he was playing snooker as a first-rate snooker specialist in Manchester. I was absolutely dumbfounded. He won, of course, the game against these two, a high marks, and then he dropped his cue. I gave him his jacket, and then within a minute, he was the emperor of Ethiopia. This was what he was, you know. And whoever met him, whether they were Europeans or whether Ethiopians or even Africans, Nelson Mandela calls him the African giant. And he says the first time he saw a man inspecting his troops, a black man inspecting black troops who were highly armed, highly modern. It was in the early 1960s when he came to Ethiopia. And he said, when I saw this man, this little man, with that fine face, full of dignity, I knew that we Africans were meant to win the war against colonialism. So he was stricken and smitten by him as much as other Europeans were. I think there are very few people who would be able to tell you more about the emperor's personal character. Perhaps my grandfather would have been in a better position to tell you more. My father, perhaps. But whatever it is, he was a unique personality who guided his people for over 60 years, both as the regent and as emperor.
Could I switch gears very rapidly to being a military historian myself? How would you define Haile Selassie as a war leader, in the sense that I think we can talk of three crises of his life, all three of which culminated in a battle. First of all, so to speak, the Ethiopian Wars of the Roses, the Wars of the Cousins, which culminated in the Battle of Sagale in, I think, 1916,
60.
between the Negus Mikhail of Wollo and the forces of, largely led by one Dossen Kassa, or am I getting a bit
My grandfather himself.
Yeah.
Yes.
Then the next battle, another crisis, the revolt of Ras-Bukzawule and the Battle of the Plains of Ankim,
Yes.
which I don't think
He
the emperor took part in
That's right.
directly. And of course, finally, the third great crisis, the Battle of Maichu, where he actually commanded the Ethiopian forces after the defeat of Ras Mulugeta.
Yes. Well, as far as the Battle of Sagele is concerned, I mean, the man of the day was undoubtedly Vitar Ali Haftegiorgis, who led the Central Ethiopian Army. A fascinating man. You know, if King Michael had taken steps to go and fight Addis Ababa the minute he got news that his son had been banished, with 100,000 Wollo troops, he would have entered Addis Ababa without any problem, because there were hardly any troops gathered. But this very wily Ethiopian war minister, he sent guns, ammunition, and he said, "My lord, do you really believe we, the servants of Menelik, are going to get rid of our dear Emperor Ieyasu? No, he's a young man and he has not been listening to what we said. Don't you worry, everything is in order." Whilst he was saying this, he was waiting for his troops from Gandabaret, from Wallagga, and from the other southern parts to come to Addis Ababa. So poor old King Michael decided to say, all right, everything is in order, and my son is not in terrible trouble, and he stayed in Wollo. And of course, once the troops reached Addis Ababa, within 3-4 weeks' time, we had about 120,000 troops on this side, and about 100,000 Wollo troops on the other, and they met at the Battle of Sagele. The emperor, I have to say, was at that time as Rastafari, fought valiantly on one of the front, very extremely courageous person. The other one was Ras Kassa, who then got hold of Ras Yazo, who was the Minister of War of Negus Mikhail. And there's even a nice ditty about it. Yazo bilut እንዳበደ ውሻ የሶስት ወር ራስ አሳጣው መድረሻ. Because there's only 3 months since Ras Kassa had been named Ras, and when he defeated Ras Yazo, it just said that a Ras of 3 months has got a person who is called Getir. That's the name. It was translated into. But Rastafari also played a very important role. Now, the Battle of Ancham, he had nothing to do with it. He was directing it from Addis Ababa. We should note it's the first battle in Ethiopian history where aeroplanes were used. It was the first time. I think it was the British, weren't they, who supplied us with 1 or 2 planes, but not many. And, I think there were only 2. But that was enough to sort of convince the Gondari troops who were on the side of the foe that this was a terrible instrument. And so the Battle of Ancham did not last very long. Now we come to Maichu. Of course, this was the most disastrous campaign we ever had, and from the very beginning, it was clear who the losers would be. Ladies and gentlemen, we must not forget that throughout the Second World War, neither the Germans nor the Allied forces used gas in front. They had too many bad experiences during the First World War. So the only time that gas was used was in the Ethiopian campaign in 1936. And the results, as you beautifully mentioned in your book, were disastrous. And so there was no way that Ethiopia could ever have won that war, however hard they tried. There was another thing that played a very important role. We won the Battle of Adwa in 1896 because you had a united Ethiopian nation. I'm afraid with my job this was no longer the case. The amount of Ethiopians that died on their way back, I'm afraid with my job this was no longer the case. The amount of Ethiopians that died on their way back from my job to Addis Ababa was horrendous. Because the Rayans of Wollo, and some people of the province of Wollo, wouldn't accept the fact that their leader, the Jiyasu, had died, and they rebelled, and they went against the Ethiopian troops. So that the emperor was forced, he could not go back through Desi. He was forced to go to Lalibela and Fitchet and come back to Addis Ababa the longer way.
And a final question from me, if I may, on this period. When the emperor was debating whether he should leave Ethiopia or stay and either go to Gori or face the Italians in Addis Ababa, Latatakele Walde Hawariat came into his presence and put a pistol in his own mouth, saying, Janhoi, are you not the son of Theodore? Now, what do you think was the right thing for His Majesty to have done? A difficult situation all round.
To be very honest with you, this is false gallantry. Everything was lost at that time. There was absolutely no hope to regain Ethiopian independence whilst the Ethiopian emperor being within Ethiopia. What did we have? We had lost most of the troops. We had no access to arms. Don't you forget, although we were the people who were invaded, the gracious League of Nations had forbidden any member to sell arms to Ethiopia. And of course Italy was able to produce armaments themselves. So we were it was an incredible situation, and I think it was right that the emperor should go out to bring the case of Ethiopia to the League of Nations at that time. I don't think we had a true alternative. What good would it be to us if they had found him somewhere in Wallega or in Gore or anywhere and killed him? The entire Ethiopian resistance would have been diminished. So I'm very much in favor of his coming to Europe, and of course these were his finest hours. The emperor in Geneva, the treatment he received was abominable. You mustn't forget, Avenol, the Secretary General of the League of Nations, was quite a fascist, a great admirer of Hitler and Mussolini. He didn't allow him to do most of the things. They were even in the forefront. They didn't want him to speak, because no head of state has ever spoken to the League of Nations, they said. And you're not allowed. And apart from everything else, the realpolitik says that Ethiopia is already invaded, is under the Italian invasion. The fact that he managed to come and talk, that in itself was a great feat. And you mustn't forget, the minute he walked in, the fascist journalist started to whistle and to shout, and Avenol, the president, didn't say a thing. We Ethiopians have a hero of that day. His name is Titulescu, who was the foreign minister of Romania. The only one delegate who stood up and said the famous words, Monsieur le Président, à la porte les sauvages. And it's only then that Avenol reacted and threw these people out. Otherwise he wouldn't have been able to give the speech he gave. A very historical speech, saying that this little match that has been lit in my country today will engulf Europe as a major disaster. And within 3 years, his prophecies came true. And what the emperor did after that, his life in Great Britain in exile, I can assure you, was not an easy thing at all. He had the heart of the British people. There's no doubt about it. British public voice was with the emperor. Unfortunately, the government wasn't. They declined to help him in every way. Even our great friend, Anthony Eden, started to go back. And there's a brilliant piece in Anthony's book, which I was glad to take over, in my book, about a meeting in the summer of 1936. The emperor had come to lobby the House of Commons, and the members were giving him tea on the terrace of the House of Commons. And then the Prime Minister suddenly appeared. He called the waiter and said, "Who are these people who are there?" He said, "Oh, these are members entertaining the Emperor of Ethiopia." He was too old to jump from the terrace because he did not want to shake his hand. So by the wit of a very clever waiter, he probably took a piece of cloth and hit him like this. He managed to escape. Baldwin did not want to shake hands with the Ethiopian emperor because he was not welcome. And they would have thrown him out if British public opinion was not in his favor. They would have done it a long time ago.
Angela, I think it's your turn to come up with.
Okay. Well, first of all, thank you very much for the invitation. I'm very honored to be here. And just to prove the British friendship and remembrance of Haile Selassie, I was late or panicking. And as I was explaining to my taxi driver why I had to be here and what it was about, and he said, are you giving a presentation? I said, no, it's a book about Haile Selassie, and the author, luckily, hopefully will be there before me. And so, but we need to get there. And he said, oh, Haile Selassie, yes, I remember. So, score number 1, 2014 in a day and age. And so we had a long chat while he was driving me here. So it just proves that the personage and the history is remembered. And I think this then leads me on to say why this book is, I think, very apt and very important coming at this time. And I just want to say a few words in general, and then we'll talk about the book and my own connection to in a very tiny way. This book comes, I think, at a very interesting and lively time now, actually, in both scholarship and memoirs coming from Ethiopia and Ethiopians living overseas and writing in all their national languages now. And so I press the publishers, please get more and more translation money for them, because there is memoirs coming. So I think this is a very important time when all of these are coming together, and there's been a little space and stability so that one can begin to put some distance and make sense of a lot of these histories, and some of them, obviously very painful, but I think, they need to be written, and histories come from all corners. And I think, and I want to also recognize at this moment and the passing of Ambassador Zode Retta, because it would have been marvelous to have had him here on this panel. He was coming to London to launch his book, and it would have been a nice follow-up to have had the two, one after the other. For those of you who, and again, hopefully maybe we get that into English, the book on the Kadamawi Haile Selassie Mangist, which is a very also important book, and you've used it a lot, and that would have been interesting. just from my perspective, I'm not an Ethiopian historian, I'm an anthropologist, and my interest in these issues is also looking at the performance of power, of which, as you mentioned, the Haile Selassie story is very, very important. And in your book, your book marvelously captures what we all, and this is what I want to digress into, we all recognize and resonate, that performance of power, that performance of dignity, that performance of kibur, mangist, sultan. He had all of those. And I resonate with a lot of your little vignettes that you tell. I was very fortunate. I grew up in Ethiopia, and my mother worked for Princess Sahai in the Tübingen school. And for a small moment, I was very privileged in that I used to go and play with some of the children of the royal court. And so in those occasions, we did actually go and, as the children did, sit with His Majesty, and he would come and visit the various palaces to be with the children. So in that tiny moment, I remember the emperor as grandfather, as father, as the relative, not just the emperor, but and at the same time as a young school child. A few years later, the stories that you tell when you were in the car moving around Addis Ababa, and Haile Selassie stopping his car every now and then to just pick and choose someone to come and talk to and call them over. And I was one of those. Again, I was walking home from school and we heard the put of the... There was a very famous motorcyclist, a sergeant with a big mustache who always accompanied. He had a nickname. What was it? Bakala, yeah. Shamal Bakala. Yeah, there, you know, and everybody knew him. And there we were bowing, you know, and we were waiting. Has he gone? No? Okay, we were still there. And then there was a tap on the shoulder, and there was Shambol Bakal, and he said, come, and there was I think it was one of the Rolls Royces, and His Majesty was there, and he asked me, he talked to me and my friend, what were we doing, you know, etc., and he gave us the very famous yellow $5 note. So, I resonate that, and I have another story of a gold coin incident as well, but I leave that because we're here to hear you. So the Majesty, the Emperor, the history, the legacy, and you capture the whole marvelously. This, for those who haven't read this book, it is part documentary history, and you know your gallop. You swing us through Addis Ababa and Ethiopia, Geneva, and we feel, and as I say, we smell. You bring the characters. You're marvelous in bringing back all the vast sweeps of the historical moments into a very succinct time of that event, that issue, and again, following the emperor, strategizing, thinking, making the decision, and then the impact all these decisions have, and what you do, I think, and what the book does marvelously is there is a lot of hype about His Majesty. There's a lot of stereotypes. Of course, we know all the scurrilous ones of the war days and everything. But I think you bring us a little bit closer to the real man and the real strategizing, and he was, I think, and everybody who's met him, it was this computing brain. Everybody talks about his dignity and his piercing eyes and you know, and yes, for the outsider, but I think when you get to know him more, it was a man who was always, as you quote someone saying, thinking, and and that was what was seemed to be going on, and what all that one was aware of. What I missed a little was a bit more on actually being the royal child, the royal childhoods. How, and this is maybe your next book, but how you're the second generation, the new modernizers. What were your discussions? What was His Majesty saying about the people he was meeting as he gave the 5 bird notes, and your own summaries of the kings and queens you met, and your own discussions of what a new aristocracy, what the new princes would be, but it was a great book. Just to add a few things. The 2 tumultuous events, you were in the palace in the 60s during the attempted coup. I was in Arat Kilo, living in the Menelik school, and we both went through that trauma. Your family was killed. A lot of those families were my parents' families and fathers of people I knew, and we kind of, it all brought it back to me, and the whole story of Germanoai. You mentioned some of the songs about what was the people talking about the emperor, but also I also remembered the taboo subjects and the one song, and I wanted to ask if you remembered this maybe. And I forget who was it. Was it the singer? It was Al Chalkum Marareng Salache. It's like, don't sing that.
Yeah.
That is. It's not really about love, and I'm tired. It's about politics. So there were those, because in the Arada there was also talk about these issues, and so I just wanted to ask you a little bit. Yeah.
I'm very grateful that you mentioned that. Of course, now after having gone through the 30s and 40s, we're coming to the 50s. And I would say that this was the highlight of the emperor's rule. It ended in 1954 by the Ethiopian emperor going out of Ethiopia for over 6 months. He did the grand tour of Europe and America. Hardly any Ethiopian emperor was away for such a long time from his own country. So this was a very big first. And there's a little incident which I relate in my book. There were old servants of Emperor Menelik, Kanyazmach Dehane, whose son I knew, and who invited me to lunch one day, and he said, "Look, come and I will tell you something about your grandfather." He said in 1955, when it was announced on the Ethiopian radio that the Ethiopian emperor was going to leave the country for 6 months, the old servants of Emperor Menelik came together and said, "This emperor is really out too much. Do you realize if people see that it can become night without an emperor, and that the day the sun will shine without an emperor, one day the people will say, why the hell do we need an emperor? Because the sun comes out without him, and the sun sets without him. So we must do something and talk to the emperor." He said, "Who should we go to?" Said, "Oh, there's the old man, the Ras Casa. We should go and speak to him." So they come up and relate this to Ras Casa and tell them, "Well, look here, you have to go and tell him that he shouldn't be doing this." And Ras Casa just turned round and said, "Dehane, I thought you were a very wise man, but you haven't understood anything." But he said, "What do you mean? I'm surprised that you say this to me." And he looked at him and he said, "Things have changed. Countries have changed, and emperors have changed. He couldn't quite understand what it was, so he went back. Immediately after that, a great propaganda machinery started in Ethiopia with songs. There was Makonnen Hatold, who was a major patriot, who had formed this patriotic association of Ethiopia with singers and so forth. And the minute he started going to Europe, first of all to Europe and then to America, or the other way around, first to America, there was a song called Takil Tolona, Ethiopia Hezbollah. Where are you, Emperor? Where are you? The Ethiopian people are yearning for you. Come back again. And this was really, it was full, this was a feeling which the Ethiopians very much felt about the emperor at that time. An incredibly successful visit, both in Europe, Great Britain, Germany, America, the Scandinavian countries, an incredibly wonderful visit. And then, a year later, he celebrates the 25th anniversary of his coronation in 1955. This is the moment where I feel that something should be done. After 25 years in power, one should have looked back and said, how far have we come? And indeed, a major thing happened. Ethiopia was given its second constitution in 1955. Until then, we were being led by the constitution of 1931. Eritrea had been reunited with Ethiopia in 1952, so we needed a new constitution. And as a matter of fact, the constitution of 1955 was not bad at all for those situations we had in Ethiopia at that time. The problem was, it was not implemented properly. Basically, Ethiopia, although under the absolute rule of the Ethiopian emperor, was a constitutional monarchy officially. But we all knew that in reality this was not the case. So from 1955-56 onwards, things started to change. The first highly educated Ethiopians started to come back. They had been to Europe. They had seen situations in other places, how far these countries had developed, and by how very little things had changed in their own country, in Ethiopia. So the first form of opposition started. Until that time, the emperor was the hero, specifically of the young Ethiopians, the students, the scholars, because they knew how much care he took. Don't forget, he held the post of Minister of Education himself for many years, because that is what he really wanted most, was to educate his people. Now these people come from all over the world, and they start saying, well, things are not as good as we thought they were. Unfortunately, we didn't feel that, and not much was done. And the first big problem arose in 1960, when the Imperial bodyguard under Mengistu rebelled against the emperor when he was on a state visit in Brazil. Luckily, the coup d'etat was won by the Ethiopian Imperial Army, who was still loyal to the Ethiopian emperor, and we were given another chance. And the tragedy of Ethiopia is that we never made use of the chances we were given in 1960. The tragedy of the emperor is that these last 14 years of his life, between 60 and 14, nothing really moved. The Almighty had shown us where things were going wrong, what we had to expect if we didn't do something radical, that we needed reforms from the top. And unfortunately, for 14 years, no reforms came from the top. In 1966, Ethiopia celebrated the 25th anniversary of its independence, of regaining its independence, and everybody said, things are going to change now. The emperor is going to abdicate in favor of his son. What happened? The only thing that changed was that the prime minister was given the right to choose his own cabinet. 1966. That was too much for this coming generation of Ethiopians. And in all the provinces of Ethiopia, things started to change. We mustn't forget, we did another mistake. In 1962, we abrogated the Eritrean Federation and annexed Eritrea to Ethiopia. The greatest mistake we have ever done. The greatest mistake we have ever done. Instead of annexing Eritrea, we should have introduced the federal solution, the federal situation we had in Eritrea to the other Ethiopian provinces. Things would have been much better. The Eritrean Liberation Front was formed, and Ethiopian politics was not the same any longer. Ethiopia became an international problem. The Arab countries put all their help and then all what they could do in order to help the Eritrean Liberation Front. And the sovereignty of Ethiopia, for the first time after 1941, was put under a question mark. And still we didn't do anything. No land reform, which was desperately needed. By the way, undoubtedly land reform was the issue of the Ethiopian revolution. Land to the tiller was the key word of the revolutionaries in 1974. The terrible tragedy is, it's true, in 1974, 90% of the country, of the land was owned by us, the Imperial House, the aristocracy, and the Ethiopian Church. And a great number of the Ethiopian farmers were our tenants. The terrible tragedy is, 40 years after the revolution, 40 years of so much misery, the Ethiopian farmer is still not the one who owns his land. Yesterday he was our tenant, and for 40 years he has become the tenant of the Ethiopian government. No free farmers, no land that is owned by farmers. Land to the tiller. Land still does not belong to the tiller in Ethiopia. Yes.
Can I say, before we take questions from the floor, which apparently I've got to choose, so please put your hands up high. I'd just like to say that I'm rather glad Her Majesty the Queen is not present here to hear all this talk of abdication. Particularly right. Who can we have a question from first? Yes. Could you say your name? Just
my name is Michael McConnell. I'm the cousin of His Highness Prince Asfa-Wossen Asserate. I object what you said about the Federation of Eritrea and Ethiopia. My grandfather told me one thing. You cannot have in one country two governments. And he said either my government goes or their government goes. And he decided that it's no longer viable because every time Ethiopia is attacked, it's attacked by the North. And so he decided to eradicate the Federation. And I believe that's the correct measure. About other things, maybe you're correct, sir. But as far as Eritrea is concerned, I support my grandfather and the emperor. Thank you.
So I'm very glad. There's no doubt you cannot have two systems. Federation was forced upon us, I know. The United Nations said there is no way of giving back Eritrea to its motherland. But after it came to existence, and after all, I'd like to quote a very interesting gentleman from Eritrea who from the very beginning was against even the federal arrangement. He was on the side of the British, and the Jazmach Abraham. I interviewed him in the 1960s and I said, you come from a family that has been so pro-Ethiopian. Why were you against Eritrea joining its motherland in 1951? And he said to me, do you believe you are better Ethiopians than us? We feel we are better Ethiopians than you, because the only place where the Ethiopian flag was flying during the Italian period was in Eritrea, because we went to the Italians and said the green, yellow, red flag is not only our political symbol, it is our religious symbol. And the Italians allowed them to use the Ethiopian flag if they put a cross in the middle. And until this very day, until the revolution, in Eritrea, if people went on had a wedding, or they had to go and mourn somebody, they brought out this Ethiopian flag with the cross in the middle. But he said to me, you know, the English gave us a poison, and this poison was called freedom. We had trade unions in Eritrea during these 10 years. We had political parties. We had a free press. In these days, all three institutions were not available in Ethiopia. So we feared that you would pull us down instead of us pulling you up. That's how he phrased it. I think His Majesty is absolutely correct if he believes that you cannot have two systems in one country. That is why I would have been incredibly happy if he himself had taken over the role of accepting federalism and implementing it to the other countries. I know it must have been too much for him, because in those days centralism played a very important role in the mind of every Ethiopian. Ethiopian unity was one of our most important beliefs, and federalism was something which was not very heartwarming for an Ethiopian. But looking back, and especially looking at this present day, where Ethiopia is divided in such terrible ethnicity, I feel so bad that our country calls itself an ethnic federation. I felt that perhaps if we had started at that time and we had implemented federal rules like we have in India, all this question, and I mean the Indians have more ethnic groups and they have more languages than we have, and federalism has worked there properly, I feel that we might have been able to avoid ethnic federalism in our country. That is the only reason I say. And also to see what hell we have gone through because of Eritrea in the last 40 years. Don't forget the amount of people we have lost on both sides. And we're brothers and sisters. Whatever the Eritreans may believe, and I'm not saying anything, Eritrea is an independent state, it's a member of the United Nations, a member of the African Unity, and I don't want to touch on that at all. But I surely believe that sooner or later the day will come where Ethiopians and Eritreans will live as brothers and sisters in peaceful coexistence under perhaps a confederation. I know that there might be a time where we will have adopted the German version of until now, which existed in Germany till 1989. What was the solution between the two Germanys? Two independent countries, one nation was the key word. And I am convinced that one of these days before we all die, this will certainly be the case between Ethiopians and Eritreans.
Right, another question.
My name's Carol Catley. I knew your father quite well.
Could you wait for the mic?
I'm just wondering whether you discuss in your book what plans people were trying to make for when the emperor died. Because I remember talking to your father about that just a few months when he was in London, just before he went back to Ethiopia, for the last time. And obviously there was a lot of going, people had no idea what was going to happen afterwards, I guess. Although your father was president of the Crown Council, and he was of course trying to do, I'm sure he was trying to do something, I don't know what.
Well, I think this is a very big question. What could have been done? You see, we must not forget one thing. For the last century, Ethiopian politics has been dominated by one factor, the army. It's the army that made kings. 1916, it was the army that chose Rastafari as regent and Empress Zewditu as head of Ethiopia. Throughout those years, and that is everybody depended on the army. Whoever had the army had Ethiopia under his control. A new thing happened. Until 1941, we didn't even have a national army in the history of Ethiopia. No national army. It was only devised in 1941, after the return of the Ethiopian emperor, that we started having the Imperial Ethiopian Army. Until then, we had armies. The armies of Ras so-and-so, the armies of the Jazman so-and-so, they all came together when there was a foreign foe to help the emperor defeat the foe. Things changed. The emperor established the one army, provincial armies were forbidden, and this institution started to dictate. As long as the Ethiopian army was loyal to the crown could exist. The minute the Ethiopian army was disloyal and had nothing to do with the crown ended. It is a pity that we did not make other civilian arrangements in order to control the army. There were some ideas, like the territorial army, which we had established, but then not much importance was given to it. But between then, things went out of control in 1974. So many factors played a role of why the Ethiopian Revolution came by. The famine in Wondo played a very important role. The rising of the oil prices going sky high, taxi drivers going on road, teachers not getting enough payment. Everything came in one bag. And you know, I always say, you English, you have shown us something grand. We must never forget, it is the English, not the French, who cut off the head of an anointed monarch. You were one, but then you learned your lesson, and you became more liberal and put reforms before the people even thought of it. You taught us with this wonderful institution called the Glorious Revolution. If you didn't have this, what would have happened to you? And when, because you had it, you were laughing your heads off when the French Revolution came. You said, oh, you continental Europeans, the rights you want to have, we've had them for 100 years. And I wish this would have been the case in Ethiopia, that we were able to implement reforms from the top before the people demanded it. That is the only way we can get rid of revolution.
Right. I think, AsfaWossen, I'll have to ask you to keep your replies a bit shorter, otherwise we won't get in enough questions. I don't know quite how long we've got now left.
I've not seen your yeah.
Yeah.
There was a bad person.
Right, but I think first we have here.
Very quickly, congratulations, as I'm a proud younger brother of AsfaWossen. It's a special day for me to see him launch his book on Haile Selassie. I'd like to draw your attention. Many years ago, as teenagers, we went to Jalmeda to see Indian circus.
Yes.
Our father was in Addis, and the emperor was present, and our minder found us a place very far from the emperor, And Asfa-Wossen went mad. He said, I should be near Haile Selassie. And we finally made it. Not so close, but very close to it. And it showed me that from that day on, Asfa-Wossen had this interest on this unique person in many ways. But my question now is, I think in the case of Ethiopia under the emperor, the reckoning power was not the army but the church. Haile Selassie wielded more power through the church than through the army. A case in point was it was the intervention of the church that aborted the coup d'etat. All right? Today, where it is secular, it may not matter, it might be the army. But during Haile Selassie's time, forget about him being the field marshal of Ethiopia, but he was also the defender of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church. He appointed bishops, abbots, call them what you want, and the backbone to his power was the Ethiopian Orthodox Church.
Very true. Without the church, you wouldn't have come to power anyhow. This was 1960. I'm afraid by 1974 this was no longer the case.
Oh, yes.
By that time, the church had fallen into difficult times itself. And let us not forget, 3 days before the emperor was taken off from power, the Ethiopian patriarch blessed the Ethiopian revolution. We must never forget that. He was the defender of the faith. And he blessed the Ethiopian revolution. In other words, we must not forget, by that time even the church had left it. Although, as you rightly said, the emperor was the one who brought sovereignty to the Ethiopian church. It was under his rule that Ethiopia got its first patriarch. First bishops came to Ethiopia because of his intervention. But unfortunately, church and state had lost their combination for a very long time. I would certainly say, after the death of Abuna Vasileios, things started to change. Until then, his personality, and not only the fact that he was the first Ethiopian patriarch, but his own personality played such an important role that what he did in 1960 was accepted. I wouldn't think the same would have mattered if Abuna Theophilos was Ethiopian patriarch in 1960. I do not believe that it would have worked as much as it did because it was the word of Abuna Vasileios. But you're right, church always played a very important role, and it is high time that church and state were divided, not only in Ethiopia but everywhere else. This is the one really terrible point about orthodoxy in this world. The nearness of churches. It is not only Ethiopia. Take Bulgaria, take Romania, all the Orthodox countries, take Russia. You see, the nearness of the church and state leads the church to become political. And as I always say, the church then starts saying, every man of my mother is my father. In other words, every government that comes to being is my government. And that is not what the church should be saying, but it should devote its time to what the laws of Jesus Christ say and to what human rights tell us to do.
Yes, over there. No, sorry, it wasn't the hand up. A mistake.
There was somebody on the right-hand side, I don't know. Oh yes, please.
Yes,
Lady.
yes.
What is your fondest memory of your interaction?
With the Emperor?
Your fondest memory. What is the memory you most treasure throughout your life with him?
I have to tell you, the fondest memory was to be on his side when the Ethiopian national anthem was played. I have never felt as a child a feeling of belonging, identity, and pride as to be beside that man. I know it sounds silly, but this is a real childhood feeling which I have not, unfortunately, had again. But to stand next to this man who's saluting, and if you see the picture I have chosen for my book, has a little to do with this too. Saluting the Ethiopian flag. By the way, some of you who are conscious of uniforms and orders will, I hope, have realized that the Emperor of Ethiopia is wearing the Order of the Garter. And this photograph was taken in Addis Ababa in 1965 when the Queen came on a state visit.
I'm very happy to be here and listening to your explanation of your book. Really, I wish Ethiopia had a person like you, intelligent, articulate, early enough, before things went wrong. I would like to ask one question. In your book, I don't know, I haven't read it, I just wrote it. Have you been able to explain why the emperor, despite his aging, he did not make any attempt to hand over power? Has it been analyzed in this book? I very much expect to learn something about that. Thank you.
Yes, I've tried my best as much as I can, and I have related everything I have come across. I have related what my father told me, that they all tried their very best in order to make him realize that time has come. There's a scene in my book, which was told to me by my father, which appeared on his birthday, on the 80th birthday of the late emperor. My father goes very early in the morning to congratulate him with my mother, and he's still in the salon next to his bedroom. And from one moment to the other, my father flings himself onto his feet. And the emperor says, "What has happened to you? What has happened to you?" And he told him, "Your Majesty, I have come to ask you for a great favor." And he said, "What is it?" And he said, "Today is our day. Today is the day of Ethiopia. Today is your day. The only thing you have to do now is to go out and tell the Ethiopian people, give me my pension. I have served you for over 6 years, both as regent and as emperor, and I want to retire to Jerusalem. Here is my son. Trust him, give him your aid, give him the loyalty you have shown to me, and you will go down in history as the greatest of all Ethiopian emperors." For a while, he was taken by it, but immediately after that, his answer was, "Did Solomon abdicate? Did King David abdicate? Or do you know of any Ethiopian emperor that has ever abdicated? We will rule the country as long as God will allow us, then we will go." My dear friend, we're talking about a monarch, because we all know how difficult it is for monarchs to go away. Adenauer, who was not a monarch, gave the Germans as much help as he could, and other democratic politicians have done the same thing. Look at our African leaders now. There was a time when the ambition of every African president was to become president for life, for decades. That is no longer the case. Today, they want to have dynasties. They want to have their children become presidents. And in 3 African countries, we have managed to do exactly that. New dynasties by history. And that is our problem. To say no, to say enough is enough. We cannot blame the Ethiopian emperor, looking back at what generation he belongs to, where he comes from, what his mind was. Don't you forget, he's a child of the 19th century. He was launched by the ideas of the beginning of the 20th century. And he went far more than anybody could have ever thought. And he transformed the face of Ethiopia in 60 years. But there was not much more he could do. There was not much more that he was able to do. Because I think it was too much. The world has changed too much in his face. Yes, the gentleman. The gentleman.
Very grateful for your inviting us to this occasion, because there's a lot of wisdom oozing from you, and we need it. My name is Ron Lutaya. I'm the representative of the Kabaka of Uganda, and he says hello to you. My question is about the monarchs in Africa, existing monarchs. What advice would you give existing monarchs?
You see, in Uganda, you are in this wonderful position where you have a presidential democracy, but you still have, how many? 5 African kings, who are the cultural heads of their people. And I must confess that I'm a great friend of the great king of Baganda, King Ronnie Mutede II, who's a great friend from old days, and I think he's a wonderful example how democracy and kingdoms can live together. And I wish that African monarchs could be exactly that, the bearers of their traditions and the people who are there to partake in the cultural rejuvenation of their nation, as this is happening in Uganda. And I think all the 5 kingdoms are doing a very good job, if I may say so. Yes.
That's right at the back there.
Far away from politics, that's what I wanted to add.
Hello, far away from politics. The statue that you've got of Haile Selassie in Wimbledon,
yes.
Not many people know about it.
May I say a few words about that?
Does anybody know about it?
I do.
A few. I just wondered, could we get it moved to Parliament Square, please?
Well, first of all, I'm very happy that it still exists.
It's been there since 1937.
Yes. And Hilda Seligman is the lady who did it, a wonderful English sculptress, by the way, a suffragette, a great friend of Sylvia Pankhurst. Yes, absolutely. So, I must tell you this very quickly. Our great hero, Sylvia Pankhurst, her first meeting with the Ethiopian emperor in London, she goes to the embassy to meet him. And she says, Your Majesty, you must understand, I am a socialist. I am not for you because you're an emperor. I am for you because your cause is just. This is what Sylvia Pankhurst said. And that is why I'm very glad to say the entire women's movement in the 30s on the side of Ethiopia. I have to say that.
I think it's time for one more question only, I'm afraid. Okay, let's go to the front here.
We have a lady, yes.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I haven't read your book yet.
Yes.
I just wanted to ask, there's a whole generation which came after the revolution, which has grown up without even knowing that Ethiopia is a king, an emperor and other kings. What do you think could be done to rectify this situation?
The lady is asking me that a whole generation of Ethiopians have developed after 1974, after the revolution, who don't even know that Ethiopia had an emperor or had emperors, and she's asking what could be done to change this attitude. Well, first of all, I would be very happy if Ethiopian history was taught in Ethiopian universities in the future. Let us start with that. That would be a privilege on its own. Yes, it is true. Ethiopia has now a population of 90 million, out of which 85% are under the age of 25. So that means 85% of all Ethiopians have never lived under an emperor or have an absolutely no relation towards the crown. And look at all the abuse that was thrown at the crown throughout these 40 years. So it's not going to be easy to make this viable for the new generation. But ladies and gentlemen, that is not the subject. The future of Ethiopia does not lie in the question whether we should have an emperor as head of state or a president. What we need to establish is the sovereignty, the unity, and the brotherhood of all Ethiopians, of all Ethiopian ethnic groups, so that Ethiopia will be a united state, as it has been for over 3,000
years. Well, I'm afraid we've got to end there, as our time has run out, unfortunately. I'm sure this could have gone on for several hours yet, as people got more involved with questions. I'd just like to end on a high note with a little anecdote not included in AsfaWossen's splendid book, which, by the way, costs only £20. And that is a story that was told me, I wasn't there myself, about Nasser's funeral in Cairo, when the heads of state had to process behind the funeral bier of Colonel Nasser. And Haile Selassie was there, and on the one side of him was the president of Algeria, who was a very tall chap, whose name now slips my mind, Ben Bella. On the other side was President Giscard d'Estaing of France, and Haile Selassie was in the middle. The crowds ululating with grief at Colonel Nasser's departure from this life burst through the barricades, and the heads of state were extremely worried about Haile Selassie being swamped by the crowd. So Ben Bella looked over at Valéry Giscard d'Estaing, Valéry Giscard d'Estaing looked back at Ben Bella, and by a unanimous accord, one grasped the emperor by the left elbow, one grasped the emperor by the right elbow, and up they lifted to their own height. And apparently, whatever Angelo may say, he retained his perfect dignity. I think we'd all like to congratulate AsfaWossen on the splendid book. Only sadly hasn't translated it into English himself, which I'm sure he'd be perfectly capable of doing.
May I say that I had a wonderful translator who is here today. Peter, perhaps you would stand up and receive the I can assure you it is not easy to translate from German into English. Not verbatim, but to also get the idea of the author, of what he really means to say. And I'm glad to say Peter did a wonderful job. He's a great scholar of German, and he studied at the other place, whose name I don't know. But he did a splendid job, speaks perfect German, and I'm very, very glad that he was my translator.
Well, we're very glad to hear that. I think that's what I said about Asfa-Wossen translating himself. Then, of course, there's the old Italian saying, tradutore traditore, translator traitor. Obviously not the case here. And I'm sure we'd all like to congratulate Asfa-Wossen, and to thank him for having written the book, for his presentation today, and for all of you for having come here, and hopefully we might later on tonight drink a toast to the memory of His Majesty. Thank you very much.